Rome didn't fall apart. It kept moving. Coins still changed hands. Ships still crossed seas. Soldiers still lined up for pay. From the outside, nothing looked broken enough to worry about. That's what makes this dangerous. We're used to believing economies die loudly, with chaos, with shortages, with moments everyone remembers. Rome offered something worse. It kept functioning while the foundation shifted underneath it. Money didn't disappear. It didn't stop working. It just stopped behaving the way people expected. Prices made sense until they didn't. Payments arrived, but not with the same certainty. Value still existed, but it felt softer, harder to pin down. Not enough to panic, just enough to adjust behavior quietly. And when millions of people start adjusting quietly, systems don't shatter. They drift. An economy doesn't need collapse to begin failing. It only needs trust to thin while everything else keeps going. Rome reached that point early, while the machinery still looked intact. This story doesn't start with collapse. It starts with coordination. An empire this large only functions when payments arrive when they're supposed to, when prices mean roughly the same thing everywhere, and when obligations can be trusted without constant enforcement. Power depends on that reliability more than it depends on armies or laws. Rome didn't lose control of its territory first. It lost control of its guarantees. Not all at once, not dramatically. Just enough that money stopped being a perfectly solid promise and became something people paid attention to. Once that happens, behavior changes before policy does. People shorten time horizons. They protect themselves quietly. They stop assuming the system will carry tomorrow the way it carried yesterday. Nothing here requires invasion or crisis. Just small failures in payment reliability repeating often enough to force adaptation. When money stops coordinating people automatically, authority has to work harder to get the same result. And that's where the strain begins to show. Rome didn't need constant force to function. It needed coordination. Across vast distances, people acted as if the system would hold tomorrow the same way it held yesterday. Farmers planted, knowing what taxes would be due. Merchants shipped goods, knowing prices wouldn't rewrite themselves mid-journey. Contracts weren't gambles. They were expectations. At the center of this coordination sat money that behaved consistently. Silver coins didn't surprise anyone. Their value wasn't debated daily. A coin received in the morning meant roughly the same thing by nightfall. That stability removed friction. Transactions moved quickly because no one had to stop and question the unit itself. The army reflected that same logic. Soldiers weren't just paid, they were paid on time, in coin that still worked when they spent it. That regularity mattered more than ideology. An army that trusts its pay doesn't hesitate, it doesn't bargain, it doesn't drift. Food reinforced everything. Grain flows didn't just prevent hunger, they prevented panic. When basic prices stayed stable, money stayed believable. When money stayed believable, planning stayed possible. Trade followed predictability, not power. A merchant didn't care who ruled a province as long as the coin at the port meant the same thing as the coin at home. Distance stopped being a risk because the system absorbed it. Nothing here was dramatic, and that was the strength. The Roman economy worked because it removed uncertainty before it appeared, and systems like that don't collapse loudly. They change quietly, long before anyone thinks to look. A Roman coin worked long before anyone inspected it. No one weighed it in their palm. No one asked where the silver came from. The coin passed because everyone assumed the next person would accept it too. That assumption mattered more than the metal itself. Trust turned money into speed. A merchant could sell without stopping to negotiate value. A soldier could accept pay without questioning what it would buy tomorrow. A tax collector could move revenue across provinces without defending every transaction. At small scale, trust isn't essential. People can barter, they can argue, they can adjust. But Rome wasn't small. It ran on distance, on time, on coordination between strangers who would never meet again. That only works when money doesn't demand attention. The moment people start checking, counting, or hesitating, everything slows, markets thicken. Payments take longer. Risk creeps into places where none existed before. Not because goods disappear, but because confidence does. Trust allowed Rome to operate as a single system instead of thousands of local ones. It replaced negotiation with acceptance. It turned belief into infrastructure. And infrastructure only matters when it starts weakening. Pressure didn't arrive as a shock. It arrived as accumulation. The army cost more to maintain than before, not because it failed, but because it stayed active longer. Borders needed constant funding. Garrisons became permanent. Readiness stopped being temporary and turned into a standing expense. At the same time, expansion slowed. Not stopped, just slower. New territory still came in, but not fast enough to offset what the system now demanded every year. Revenue growth lost its margin. Cities grew heavier too. More administration, more logistics, more spending to keep order, supply food, and move money across distance. None of this was wasteful. It was the cost of running a system that already worked and couldn't afford disruption. The important part is this. Nothing here felt urgent. The treasury still paid. Trade still moved. The army still showed up. Each increase in cost was manageable on its own. Each adjustment made sense inside the moment. Strong systems don't crack when pressure enters. They absorb it, they stretch, they rebalance quietly. Rome did exactly that. It didn't treat these changes as danger. It treated them as normal growth pains. But pressure doesn't disappear when it's absorbed. It waits. And eventually, the system has to decide where that pressure goes. The solution didn't look like a solution. The coins stayed the same size. The stamps stayed familiar. The faces didn't change. Nothing announced that value had shifted. Nothing warned the system to adjust. But inside the coin, there was less silver, not enough to notice at first, not enough to force a reaction, just enough that more coins could be made from the same supply of metal. Obligations could still be met. Salaries could still be paid. The numbers on paper still balanced. From the Treasury's perspective, nothing broke. The same promises were being honored with the same symbols. Payments arrived. Trade continued. The system moved forward without interruption. And that's what made it dangerous. Quantity increased without changing appearance. The unit stayed the same while the substance thinned. Each new coin quietly carried less certainty than the one before it. People didn't wake up and reject the currency. They spent it normally. They accepted it normally. The shift hid inside routine. But money doesn't need to fail openly to change behavior. It only needs to lose consistency. Over time, merchants noticed that prices no longer matched past expectations. Soldiers noticed their pay covered less. Long-distance trade adjusted terms without explanation. No one needed to be told what was happening. They felt it transaction by transaction. The currency didn't collapse. It drifted. And once drift enters money, every agreement built on it starts recalibrating in ways the center can't fully control. There was no reason to panic. The Treasury still paid. The army still moved. Trade routes stayed open. On every surface measure that mattered day to day, the system functioned. When institutions keep working, pressure looks like noise, not threat. Early damage didn't demand correction because it didn't interrupt operations. Costs rose, but slowly. Prices adjusted, but unevenly. The effects spread across distance and time, making them hard to trace back to a single cause. Strong systems are built to absorb strain. Rome's was especially good at it. It redirected pressure instead of confronting it. Small losses were offset by small adjustments. Nothing forced a moment of reckoning. And because nothing forced it, nothing stopped it. Fixing the currency would have required reducing spending or collecting more metal. Both options carried immediate risk. Doing nothing felt safer, especially when doing nothing still produced results. So the system continued as designed. It met obligations. It enforced order. It moved money where it was needed. The danger wasn't ignorance, it was stability. When a system keeps functioning, it teaches everyone inside it that the cost of change is higher than the cost of continuation. People adjusted before they complained. Prices moved first, not everywhere at once, not dramatically, just enough that wages lagged behind what daily life required. Merchants responded by tightening margins, shortening credit, and avoiding long commitments when they could. Soldiers felt it differently. Pay still arrived, but its timing mattered more. Delays that once felt minor now carried weight. Bonuses didn't stretch as far. The certainty that used to surround military pay softened, and with it, patience. Provinces adapted quietly. Local authorities kept more resources close. Payments to the center became slower, less generous, more negotiated. It wasn't rebellion, it was caution. Distance made trust expensive. Trade adjusted its routes and terms. Fewer risks, faster turnover, less exposure to currency that might lose value before settlement. These weren't political choices, they were accounting decisions. None of this required coordination. Each actor responded logically to incentives as they experienced them. No one needed to understand the system to protect themselves from it. That's how economic damage spreads without drama. Not through collapse, but through millions of small decisions that make sense locally and destabilize coordination globally. The system still existed. It just moved with more friction than before. Control weakens when promises stop being automatic. Payments still happened, but their reliability mattered more than their existence. Contracts still stood, but only as long as conditions didn't change too much. Loyalty remained, but it became conditional, tied to expectations rather than assumption. Authority relies on money to travel faster than force. When pay is trusted, orders don't need reinforcement. When contracts are reliable, compliance doesn't need pressure. Rome had functioned on that advantage for centuries. As currency lost consistency, authority became more expensive to maintain. More oversight, more negotiation, more compensation to achieve the same outcome. The state didn't lose power overnight. It lost efficiency. Coordination turned fragile. Each delay required explanation. Each payment needed reassurance. Each obligation demanded confirmation. What once moved on routine now required attention. That attention carried a cost. The center could still command, but it had to spend more to be obeyed. Trust no longer filled the gaps. Money had to. When money stops being trusted, obedience doesn't disappear. It becomes transactional, and transactional authority scales poorly across distance. Nothing had to be destroyed for the system to fragment. Regions began acting locally because local decisions felt safer. Supplies stayed closer to where they were produced. Payments circulated shorter distances. Trade narrowed, not because roads vanished, but because trust did. The central treasury still existed. It still issued demands, but its relevance weakened as fewer actors depended on it directly. When money from the center arrived, uncertain or late, people planned around it instead of through it. Coordination thinned. Trade didn't stop. It localized. Markets still functioned, but at smaller scale. Long-distance exchange carried more risk than reward. The empire didn't lose activity. It lost integration. Administration followed the same pattern. Orders moved downward, but their execution depended increasingly on negotiation. Local authorities filled gaps. The center could no longer smooth over automatically. Rome still existed as a place, as a name, as an authority. But Rome as a system, a single coordinated mechanism, became harder to sustain. Not because anyone rejected it outright, but because relying on it felt expensive. The structure remained standing. What faded was the invisible web that once made it move as one. Rome wasn't unique. It was early. Any system that treats money as infinite eventually treats trust as expendable. At first, nothing seems wrong. Obligations are met. Activity continues. Adjustments feel harmless when spread across time. But trust doesn't fail like walls or armies. It erodes while everything still stands. And once belief weakens, every function built on it becomes heavier to operate. Collapse doesn't begin when land is lost or borders move. It begins when money stops coordinating behavior automatically, when every transaction needs attention, when every payment carries doubt. Rome didn't fall when it stopped expanding. It didn't fall when it lost territory. It fell earlier, and over generations, when its currency stopped being something people believed in without thinking. By the time that loss became visible, the system had already been living on borrowed certainty for a long time.